All right, let's dive into a topic that's probably keeping a lot of you security folks busy lately. We've seen this real surge in ransomware attacks.
Yeah, particularly fog and Akira.
Exactly. And what's really interesting, or maybe worrying, is this common thread popping up in a lot of analyses. SonicWall SSL VPNs seem to be involved quite a bit.
That's right. And for this deep dive, we've, pulled together quite a bit of material. Threat intel reports from places like Arctic Wolf, Sentinelone, any.ron,
Mm-hmm.
plus some really detailed technical breakdowns. The DFIR report did a great piece looking at specific incidents, the actual tools these attackers are using.
Right down to the infrastructure.
Yeah, even tracking the hosting providers like Cluviter and the specific ASNs they're operating out of. It's pretty granular stuff.
Okay, so our mission today really is to unpack all of that for you. We want to figure out how these groups are hitting this vector, what they do once they're actually inside the network.
What that whole attack chain looks like?
Yeah, who are they targeting? And most importantly, what do you, as a security professional listening right now, need to know to actually defend against this? What are the actionable takeaways?
We're hoping to connect those dots from all these different reports, give you a clearer picture of what's actually happening.
So let's start with that core problem. This increase in attacks. Arctic Wolf's report really flagged this, doesn't it?
It did. They mentioned at least 30 intrusions, specifically Akira and Fog, just since early August 2024. And SonicWall SSL VPNs were the common entry point in those.
And was it mostly one group or a mix?
It seems Akira was the dominant one in their sample, maybe 75% of those cases. Fog made up the other 25%. But the point is, it shows these groups, or maybe affiliates using their ransomware, are really leaning into this specific access method.
And the thing that always gets me with ransomware is the speed. Once they're in, how fast are we talking here?
Terrifyingly fast.
Yes.
That's the challenge, right? Reports show this really compressed timeline between that initial VPN login and when the encryption actually starts.
Like days,
It's
hours.
hours, sometimes as quick as maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours, sometimes stretching up to maybe 10 hours. But still, that's not a lot of time for defenders to react once that first alert fires, if it even does.
Wow. Okay, now, there was talk about a specific SonicWall vulnerability, CVE 2024-40766. SonicWall themselves suggested it might be under active exploitation. Is that what's happening here? Is it direct exploitation?
That's kind of the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the reports are nuanced. Look, a lot of the SonicWall devices were running firmware that was vulnerable to that CVE. That's a fact.
Right.
But finding definitive forensic proof, like this specific exploit was used in this specific case, hasn't always been possible across all reported incidents.
So maybe not the smoking gun in every case.
Exactly. What is consistently seen, though, are these malicious login events through the SonicWall SSL VPN. That's the constant observation.
Okay, so if it's not always direct exploitation, that points pretty strongly towards compromised credentials being a huge part of this.
Absolutely. The evidence really lines up there. Attackers getting hold of usernames and passwords somehow.
And what kind of accounts are we talking about? Are these like domain admin accounts tied to the VPN?
Often, no. That's what's really interesting. They frequently seem to be local accounts, configured directly on the SonicWall device itself, not accounts integrated with Active Directory or some other central identity provider.
Ah, local accounts. And the big defense mechanism that probably wasn't there?
You guessed it,
MFA.
multi-factor authentication. The sources strongly suggest that MFA was likely not enabled or enforced on these particular compromised local VPN accounts.
Which makes them low-hanging fruit if the creds are out there.
Totally. Username and password, and you're in. Whether they got those creds via phishing, brute-forcing, credential stuffing, doesn't matter once they have them if there's no MFA.
And where are these login attempts coming from? Are they trying to blend in?
Well, geographically, they seem to originate predominantly from IPs associated with VPS hosting providers, virtual private servers.
Okay, so not typical user locations.
Right. Reports even call out specific ASNs, like AS62240, which belongs to Cluviter, the known hosting provider. And what's really telling is that sometimes the same shared VPS infrastructure, maybe the same IP or range, has been seen used in separate Akira and Fog incidents.
That shared infrastructure piece is interesting. Suggests maybe shared tooling or even collaboration between affiliates.
Could be. And speaking of tools, they're not just sitting there manually trying logins, are they?
No way. There's automation involved.
Yeah, the DFIR report dug into a Fog affiliates toolkit and found this Python script, basically a SonicWall scanner.
What does it do?
It's designed to automate logging into the SonicWall Net Extender client. It takes a simple text file, usually called data.txt,
Okay.
which contains lists of potential targets and credentials, IP address, username, password, maybe even domain info. The script just churns through that list trying to log in. If it gets a hit, it can perform some initial checks.
So automating credential stuffing against VPN portals. And were these target VPNs maybe misconfigured too, making it easier?
Sometimes, yeah. Some affected services were apparently still running on the default HTTPS port for Sonic Wall Management, which is 42433.
Oof. Defaults.
Yep. And the logs, the ones the attacker has often tried to delete, they showed specific event IDs confirming the successful logins, like event ID 238 for WAN zone logins, 1080 for SSL VPN zone logins, and 10 to 79 showing the user logged in successfully and got an IP assigned. Seeing those pop up, especially followed by log deletion attempts, is a huge signal.
Okay, so they're in. They've slipped past the perimeter, often using these compromised local accounts, no MFA, probably using automated tools running from some VPS somewhere. Now they're inside. What happens next? What's the playbook?
They move fast, but methodically. First order business is usually recon, figure out the network layout, identify the juicy targets.
What tools are they using for that?
A lot of standard stuff, actually. Common network scanners like SawPerfect Network Scanner, Advanced Port Scanner. For finding network shares quickly, Sharpshares seems popular. And for domain discovery, things like NLTest or AdFind to quickly understand the Active Directory environment.
So mapping the terrain. Then I assume grabbing more credentials becomes priority one.
Absolutely. Credential access is key for everything that follows moving laterally, escalating privileges. They use the usual suspects for OS credential dumping, like Mimikatz or its Python cousin, secretsdump.py.
Standard stuff.
Yeah, but they also target specific password stores. We've saw mentions of a particular PowerShell script, veeam-get-creds.ps1. Pretty self-explanatory. It pulls credentials out of the Veeam backup replication credential manager.
Ah, going straight for the backup creds.
Yeah.
Smart in a nefarious way.
Definitely. They also use tools like DonPappy and Impacket's dpp.py to go after credentials protected by Windows DPI. That's where Windows caches sensitive stuff for browsers, saved RDP connections, certificates, that kind of thing.
And Active Directory is obviously a big target for them too.
Oh yeah, they hit AD hard. We see tools like Certipy being used. That one exploits vulnerabilities in Active Directory Certificate Services, ADCS. If templates are misconfigured, they can potentially use Certipy to forge certificates and basically become domain admins or other high-privilege users.
Wow. And Kerber roasting?
Still a classic. Tools like Orpheus are used for Kerberoasting attacks. Orpheus is interesting because it apparently includes techniques to try and change the encryption type used in the Kerberos request, potentially to evade some detection methods.
Sneaky. So they grab creds, exploit AD. How do they stitch that together to actually gain higher privileges and start moving around?
It's often a combination. They leverage the credentials they've stolen, maybe via Mimikatz or targeting Veeam, and they combine that with exploiting known vulnerabilities that might still exist on the network.
Like what? Any specific ones?
Zero Logan, for example, CVE 2020-1472. They use tools like Zerdump to exploit that. If it works, they can reset a domain controller's computer count password and effectively take over the domain.
Still seeing Zero Logan exploited years later.
Yep. And also those Kerberos vulnerabilities, CVE 2021-42278 and 42287. Tools like Pasheen or NOPAC exploit those to escalate privileges by manipulating Kerberos tickets, specifically the PAPEC.
So classic AD attack vectors.
Pretty much. And pass the hash is definitely observed too. They grab hashes, pass them around, often targeting administrator accounts to then establish RDP sessions laterally.
And for moving more broadly. Besides RDP.
Standard admin tools again. PSCZEC is common. Accessing default Windows admin shares like CNE2 or ADMINA. And more modern offensive frameworks like NetExec, which grew out of CrackMapExec, are also in the mix for lateral movement and execution.
Okay, so they're moving around, escalating privileges. How do they make sure they can get back in later? Persistence. And how do they talk back to their command and control?
For persistence, they often abuse legitimate remote access tools. AnyDesk pops up frequently in reports.
Just installing AnyDesk?
Sometimes even automating it. The DFIR report mentioned finding a PowerShell script, any.ps1 in one toolkit. It basically just silently installs AnyDesk and sets a hard-coded password for it.
Let me guess the password.
Admin #123.
Oh, come on, really?
I know, right? You'd think. Anyway, besides AnyDesk, tools like Mobax and PuTTY have also been seen, possibly used for C2 or just persistent access.
Okay, admin #123 aside, what about more sophisticated command and control?
They're definitely using modern C2 frameworks. Sliver is one that's mentioned quite a bit.
That's the open source C2 framework.
Exactly. Adversary emulation, C2,
Right.
quite capable. Things like slv.bin or Sliver client Linux executables were found in those affiliate toolkits. Reports even identified a specific IP, 194.48.154.79, hosting a Sliver C2 listener on port 31337.
Yeah, classic port.
And interestingly, another Sliver C2 instance was found hosted within that same ASN, AS62240, the Cluviter one, that was also associated with the initial VPN logins. Suggests maybe some dedicated infrastructure for these ops.
And are they tunneling that C2 traffic to try and hide it?
Yes, that's a key part of their defense evasion for C2. They use tools like proxy chains to route their traffic through various proxy types, SOTKS4, SOCKS5, HTTPS.
How does that help them?
It allows them to run tools from their C2 server, but the traffic gets tunneled through the compromised host on the victim network. So the malicious activity looks like it's maybe originating internally, and it leaves less forensic evidence directly on the endpoint they're pivoting from. PowerCat, which is like a PowerShell version of Netcat, also gets used for tunneling shells, transferring data, and it even supports DNS tunneling for really stealthy C2.
Right. Before they drop the main payload, they usually try to cripple defenses and recovery options, don't they?
Standard procedure for them, yeah. Defense evasion is critical in those final stages. You see them disabling security software, like Windows Defender. A big one is deleting volume shadow copies, using that vsadmin.exe, delete shadows all quiet command.
Takes away the easy restore option.
Exactly. Prevents victims from just rolling back files using built-in Windows features. And like we mentioned, deleting firewall logs, security logs, anything that might track their activity.
Okay, so after all that, the quick entry, the recon, credential theft, privilege escalation, setting up C2, disabling defenses, then comes the main event, the ransomware itself. What are FOG and Akira doing?
Well, the end goal is encryption, obviously. Files get renamed with extensions like .fog or sometimes .flocked for FOG and .akira for Akira.
Are they targeting specific things?
They seem pretty deliberate. They often go after virtual machine files first, things like VMDKs, VMSDs, and they actively hunt for backups. We saw a specific mention of them targeting and deleting VM backups.
Hitting VMs and backups, maximum disruption.
That's the goal. Makes it much harder for the victim to recover without paying.
And the double extortion angle, stealing data before encrypting.
Yes, that's definitely happening, especially with FOG affiliates now. They're observed exfiltrating data before triggering the encryption. And they seem targeted about it too.
How so?
They seem to prioritize sensitive data, maybe from HR shares or accounts payable folders. Reports suggest they might grab like 30 months worth of data from those areas versus maybe only 6 months from more general file shares.
And that stolen data is the leverage.
Exactly. It's used for the double extortion. Pay us, or we leak your sensitive data. They usually list victims who don't pay on their Tor-based data leak sites.
And then they leave the note.
Yep, the classic ransom note. Often just readme.txt dropped in encrypted directories. It's got the instructions, links to their negotiation portal on the dark web, the usual demands.
So who's actually getting hit by this? Is it specific industries, big companies, or more widespread?
It seems pretty widespread, honestly. The victimology data suggests these attacks are largely opportunistic. They're hitting a wide range of industries and organization sizes.
Initially, FOG seemed focused, though.
Yeah, early reports suggested maybe education and recreation sectors in the U.S. were primary targets, but they've clearly broadened out way beyond that now.
So what industries are being named in these reports?
It's quite a mix. Education, recreation, manufacturing, financial services, legal firms, state and local governments, tech companies, logistics, retail. It's really across the board.
And geographically, is it just a U.S. problem?
No, definitely not. Victims are reported in the U.S., Canada, several countries across Europe, UK, Netherlands, Germany, Italy, Greece have been mentioned, and also down in South America, particularly Brazil.
Were there any specific public examples linked to this FOG activity and the tools you mentioned?
Yes. The DFIR report drew a specific connection between a FOG affiliate and the cyber attack on the Forless Group. That's a retail company with operations in Greece, Cyprus, Bulgaria, Romania.
How did they make that link?
Based on finding some of the same specific tools and, interestingly, internal domain names associated with the Forless Group within that attacker's open directory structure that their report detailed. They also mentioned another victim, arovidi.net.br in Brazil, identified from FOG's leak site, and also found referenced in that same open directory.
Wow, okay. That really ties the technical details to real-world incidents. So this paints a pretty detailed and, frankly, quite alarming picture of how these groups operate, their speed, their methods, their reach. For the security pros listening, how do we turn this knowledge into action? What are the key defense strategies?
Understanding that playbook, how they get in, what they do right away, that's the foundation for defense, right? Given how heavily they're hitting these VPNs for initial access,
Job number one has to be.
patching.
Yeah.
Seriously, get those sonic wall devices patched, especially if they're vulnerable to critical flaws like CVE 2024-40766. Even if it's not the only way in, leaving that door open is just asking for trouble.
Okay, patching is critical, but you said compromised credentials are maybe even more common here, so.
So authentication hardening is absolutely vital. Strong, unique passwords for every VPN account, especially any local accounts on the device itself. And this is huge. Enforce multi-factor authentication. MFA everywhere you possibly can for VPN access.
No excuses for no MFA on VPNs anymore.
Pretty much. If you can, integrate VPN auth with your central identity provider like AD or Azure AD, where you likely have stronger controls. And really question if you need those local SonicWall accounts without MFA. Can they be disabled?
And monitoring those VPN logins is key too, right? Given the VPS source IPs.
Absolutely crucial. You need visibility. Watch your VPN logs closely. Alert on logins from weird places, unexpected countries, and especially from those hosting provider ASNs that keep popping up in reports like AS62240 for Cloviter, AS64236, AS32613, others mentioned.
Should you just block those ASNs?
That's a decision you have to make based on your risk tolerance and business needs. It might block legitimate traffic too,
Yeah.
but it's definitely something to consider, or at least heavily scrutinize traffic from.
Okay, so prevention is key. But we know attackers sometimes get through. Given the speed you mentioned, detection and response inside the network has to be incredibly fast.
Yeah, this is where your internal visibility really matters. EDR endpoint detection and response tools are critical. Solutions like Sentinel-owned Singularity XDR, mentioned in one source, are built for this. They monitor system behavior closely.
What can they catch specifically?
They can detect and alert on those attacker activities we discussed. So in disabling Defender, deleting shadow copies using VSMin, running Mimikatz, unusual process chains from BSESEC, a good EDR should be able to spot those TTPs and ideally block or contain the threat quickly.
And beyond just EDR alerts, what about broader log monitoring?
Essential. You need comprehensive logging and alerting to catch things EDR might miss, or just to get more context. Look for those specific indicators of compromise, those TTPs. Like, are you seeing PowerShell logs with strings from that Veeam credential script? Are you seeing weird activity from those initial VPN accounts? Privilege escalation attempts, rapid mass file changes, execution of known bad tools like network scanners?
Makes sense. And network level monitoring for C2 and data theft.
Vital. Keep an eye on network traffic. Are you seeing connections going out to known malicious IPs or domains like that Sliver C2 address? Are you seeing large unexpected outbound data flows, potentially indicating exfiltration via tools like rclone or FileZilla? And watch for unusual protocols too, like DNS tunneling for C2.
Okay, prevention, detection, response. What about just plain resilience? Being able to recover?
This is non-negotiable. Secure, isolated, and tested backups. I can't stress tested enough. Attackers will target your backups. They know if they delete them, you're much more likely to pay.
So backups need to be offline or immutable or somehow protected.
Exactly. Offsite, air-gapped, immutable storage, whatever strategy you use, make sure the attackers can't easily reach and delete your backups once they compromise your main network. And it all comes back to defense in depth. Layers. No single tool or control is perfect.
And the human layer.
Yeah.
Preventing those initial creds from being stolen.
Still fundamental.
Yeah.
Good security awareness training for employees. Teach them to spot phishing emails, report suspicious activity. That's often how these VPN credentials get compromised in the first place.
And finally, knowing what to do when the worst happens.
Have that incident response plan ready and rehearsed. Who does what? How do you isolate systems quickly? Emphasize not paying the ransom immediately. It funds the criminals and doesn't guarantee you get your data back anyway.
Yeah.
Know who to report the incident to, if required. And be confident you can restore from those secure backups.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive on Fog, Akira, and the SonicWall connection, the big takeaway seems pretty clear. It's this dangerous mix of compromised VPN credentials, often on these poorly secured local accounts,
Yeah, without MFA.
combined with incredibly fast and methodical activity once they get inside. That's a major threat vector right now.
These groups or their affiliates, they're quick. They use tools that are easy to get. They share infrastructure. It's a real challenge.
And that timeline, just hours sometimes between login and encryption, that's the really chilling part.
It is. And it leaves us, and everyone listening, with a really critical question, I think. Attackers are constantly shrinking their dwell time, right? What used to take days now takes hours, maybe less.
So the challenge is,
How do you make sure your detection and response capabilities, your visibility, your alerting, your automation, your human processes, how do you ensure all of that can actually keep pace with that level of acceleration? That's something every security team needs to be thinking about constantly.